at Field Foundation. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Chicago chapter of APIP. Wanted to start off and just welcome everyone today and tell you a little bit about APIP. APIP is a national membership and philanthropic advocacy organization dedicated to advancing philanthropy in Asian American Pacific Islander communities. It works to increase Asian American and Pacific Islander participation and leadership in philanthropy, serves as a resource for and about Asian immigrant communities. It also investigates and interrogates philanthropy, and more importantly, investigates and interrogates ourselves and our participation. So our job is not just to hold dialogue and hold space, but to be accountable. And I'm very excited about the panel that we have today. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Jay Hobart to start us off.
Hi, thank you everyone again for joining us today. My name is Jay Hobart and I'm a steering committee member of the AAPIP Chicago chapter. I'm just going to provide a brief introduction of our esteemed guest speakers and then move along to the main event. So first we have Inhe Choi, who serves as the executive director of HANA Center, Chicago's leading community organizing and social services organization dedicated to empowering Korean American and multi-ethnic immigrant communities in achieving social, economic, and racial justice. A community and civic leader for more than 30 years, Inhe has dedicated her life's work toward building strong communities and coalitions across boundaries of race, gender, class, immigration status, and more. Grace Ho serves as a secretary of the Illinois Department of Human Services. The mission of IDHS is strengthening Illinois by building up lives and communities, which is achieved through an integrated network of mental health, substance use prevention and recovery, rehabilitation, developmental disabilities, and family and community services. Secretary Ho has dedicated her career to advancing social justice by working in the nonprofit and public sector systems for change improvement through public policy development and implementation, social services provision, community organizing and engagement, and philanthropy. Unmi Song serves as the president of the Lloyd A. Fry Foundation, a private foundation that supports nonprofits serving low-income communities in Chicago. The Fry Foundation focuses its grant making in the areas of arts learning, education, employment, and health. Unmi has been involved with numerous philanthropic and nonprofit organizations, including Metropolitan Planning Council, Alliance for the Great Lakes, Forefront, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Unmi has also been appointed by President Obama to serve on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. You can view the guest speakers' full bios in the APIP newsletter we sent out yesterday or at their organization's website. And now I'll turn it over to Sonia Matthew, who will facilitate our discussion.
It would help if I can unmute, but good morning, everybody. My name is Sonia Matthew. I'm also on the steering committee and one of the co-chairs for AAPIP Chicago, and also a program officer at the McCormick Foundation, and focused on work in the democracy program, focusing on youth civic engagement, and really excited to facilitate this conversation with Grace, Unmi, and Inhe today. And just some of the background on really how this conversation emerged was, as many of you participated in some of the webinars that occurred in May during API Heritage Month. We did a session that actually explored some of the anti-racism that was happening and starting to think about addressing issues around anti-blackness. And the theme that really emerged from that conversation was how do we really deepen this understanding and kind of the ways that we can really explore what solidarity looks like in our communities. And so kind of the goals for today's dialogue is to really think about that. And then we have these tremendous leaders in three very different sectors where the work is definitely aligned and intersecting. And there's ways that we really need to work across these sectors. And I think that they will all be able to kind of speak to the power in that. And I think the other kind of unique moment we're in is that this is the 30th anniversary of APIP. And so, we have 30 years, and the role of Asian Americans in this space, I think, has definitely evolved over this time period. And and it's an interesting moment that we can really think about and reflect on, and kind of what it means to be an ally or an accomplice in this work, and really what that means to kind of take risks. So, I'll kind of call on our presenters to kind of share some perspectives on a few questions that we've prepared, and then we will have some time at the end for some Q&A that our colleague Divya will moderate. But starting out, the first question is really thinking about, what have you seen in your sector to support anti-racism efforts and or address anti-blackness? And if we can actually start with Inhe and really think about what you've seen in the nonprofit sector in response to this.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation with these awesome, our leaders in our state and beyond. So it's my honor. So yeah, we work in the nonprofit, we're in the community, and particularly after the uprising of the movement for Black Lives, we do see that there's a growing desire to learn more about racism, structural racism. And it's actually happening at the multi-generational level, which is different from before. So for example, to start with the older generation, in the case of the Korean American community, the Korean media outlets actually published HANA Center's statement on racial justice. We had actually 2 op-eds locally and nationally. So that was a real big change. And actually after seeing that op-ed, one of the grandpas who was like in his 70s called me and said, next time you go downtown for a protest, please, take me. And I'm like, we're not taking it during COVID. But that was a huge and kind of an unbelievable moment. We also, we organized a Korean American Sanctuary Church Network, which is something very different from before, with 6 ministers. And so because of their openness already, they were really interested in having a teaching about racial justice. And so we held 3 sessions in Korean language, and it was really interesting. The first thing a lot of the younger generation said is, I never heard about these topics in Korean language before. So that was a huge, it seems kind of small, but it was a real big moment. So things are happening, right? But then the younger folks are, of course, very committed to racial justice than ever before. And they're really clear about what is needed, and that the movement needs to be led by the directly impacted people. And that, so they're really looking to the leadership of the Black people to be more meaningful allies, and how do you become active agents of change in this moment? Actually, so they're very hungry about what they can do in a way that's really really meaningful. So, HANA Center, with some of the national organizations, we actually had an opportunity to organize a conversation with the leadership of the movement for Black Lives. And we had 2 days to organize, and people were like, we're all freaking out. How can we do this? We don't want to be embarrassed with no Asians coming on. We have this chance. We had 2 days, and we had over 7,500 APIs joining. And we were shocked, right? So I think it really shows a hunger among younger generation English speaking folks to learn more about that. And so for them, I think what they see as they know the allyship, but in terms of active agents and leaders, they really see the critical need to connect with the first generation or the older generation immigrants, because they see the anti-blackness, while we have it all among us, that generation needs to be addressed. And how do we have that conversation? So they've actually contacted us about, can you help us? I know that South Asian community, Desi Youth Rising, also had how to talk to aunties, which was great. Similar requests are coming to the HANA Center, at least in our community, about how can you help us? Can you give us language? Can you give us understanding of why our parents speak about Black people in certain ways? Because even though we may not be talking, I feel offended, I feel harmed by them. So there's a different level of conversation that's really happening. So, so there's definitely a growing interest, and we formed a racial justice. So we're holding listening sessions and stuff like that. But I would say definitely where people are, it's been really wonderful. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate hearing kind of all of those various ways that you've been approaching this work. And, it's interesting that you mentioned kind of the role of media. And I feel like, oh, that's a whole other perspective. We can actually really dive a little bit deeper. And I think that, the way that kind of media and journalism also kind of helps to hold our communities and government accountable as we transition, to grace. I know that within the state of Illinois, you all have been doing some really tremendous work and in really addressing anti-racism and trying to address anti-blackness, and would love to hear kind of what are you seeing in our state and leading on with this effort.
Thanks so much, Sonia. It's good to see all of you. I hope you're doing well and staying safe. It's been quite, I think, a journey over the past couple of years in coming back to the state and addressing the eroded, foundation of state government, and then quickly a year after I start really contending with COVID-19. And I think that the conversation that we're having now has a lot of relevance to COVID-19 as well, because I think we know that the impact of, positives as well as unemployment, and the impact, the indirect impact of COVID is predominantly on communities of color. Infection rates are significantly higher for the Latinx population, for the Black population, and testing access also remains an issue. And so, the question around, the governmental sector and is complicated, obviously state by state. And I think, Sonia, your question pertains mostly to Illinois, which I think is great, because I think we, in many respects, don't necessarily reflect what's happening in other states, and for sure does not reflect what's happening currently on the federal level. And so there are, just as we, in philanthropy had talked about the kind of the different levels and the different tactics that we need to take in terms of, bridging conversations, having healing conversations, learning, educating ourselves, training, building muscles to be able to have these discussions, and putting resources and creating policies to address equity, as well as practices. I think we in the state of Illinois are doing all of the above. So I could talk for hours about all the different things that we're doing. And it's hard to say that there's, to be concise about it, because it's a lens, right? It's not a niche program that we're doing. It's really the way that we're looking at all of what we do, of what we offer, how we work with staff, the policies, the decisions that we make, which is what we want it to be, which is the way that it should be. I want to give a shout out to Karenina Grimble, who I think is on the call with us. She was with me at Woods Fund and was with me at the Department of Human Services before I went to Woods Fund, and now she's come to the department to lead our Office of Strategy, Equity, and Transformation. And so I think she's been playing a critical role in helping us develop what our diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice plan looks like for the state of Illinois DHS, but also to help us implement in a variety of ways. And so I think Illinois is really, I think, advancing on this notion of racial justice and racial equity in phenomenal ways. Before COVID, our Lieutenant Governor, Juliana Stratton, with our governor, reached out and convened the Government Alliance for Racial Equity to come and do training for state agency leadership and members of the cabinet, as well as cross-secting and intersecting with leadership and staff from the Cook County. So President Preckwinkle's office, as well as with Mayor Lightfoot. And so we actually had joint sessions where the leadership from the state, the county, and the city together were learning about building relationships around issues of racial equity, diversity, equity, inclusion. And so there's a richness and an interest and a deep commitment in that regard, and that was pre-COVID. And I hope, we all hope that we get to a time where we are post-COVID soon, because I think that there's a lot more work that can be done across the different governmental sectors. But I would say even within the state of Illinois, you have cabinet agencies like ours, and then we have sister agencies, and then you have the governor's office. The governor actually also made available resources to all of our state agency cabinet members and the leadership of our agencies. And we together actually also went through diversity, equity, inclusion training. Mary Morton actually was engaged to provide that training. And from those trainings, each of us were charged with creating our own DEI plans, which I referred to that Karenina is helping us build. And so there's the policy, the practice, the training, and the education and their learning, which are all key components of what we need to do together. The last thing that I would want to say, and Unmi sent a really nice note after we sent a clarification around the federal executive order around racial equity trainings, is that we are using our voice in Illinois to push back against federal policies, actions, narratives that we think are destructive to the work that we are trying to build here in Illinois, and obviously is relevant to other states as well. And so not only around kind of the racial equity and diversity training that is trying to suppress information and history, but also we push back against public charge. And we also, we weighed in publicly, we submitted public comments. We actually even had a meeting with members of the Federal Administration Bureau of the Budget to delineate not only how harmful it would be to people, but that it actually places bureaucratic inefficiencies in our system, which is one thing that we thought would resonate with them. And then, of course, the census. The census is one of the biggest tenets or the biggest activities that we as a country engage on in our democracy. And we saw kind of time after time moving targets in terms of timelines, negative messages to suppress. And so we pushed back against those activities as well. And we emerged, having one of the strongest census efforts ever, because we work very tightly with our community members, our providers, and the advocates are our allies, not our adversaries. And I think that goes a long way to really achieving the things that we want to do together.
There's so much to kind of celebrate and acknowledge and kind of in what you just shared, Grace, and so appreciate the leadership that you and Governor Pritzker and our, the state of Illinois are really offering in this moment. I think what's so interesting is kind of the importance of how you've devoted both resources and training for folks. And I'm curious, as we transition to Unmi and what's happening in philanthropy, kind of, I would imagine there's some similarities there with both resources and training happening within the field, and many of us being in philanthropy, and would love to see kind of what you see happening to really address anti-racism and addressing anti-blackness.
Well, it's really great to see everybody. I too wish we were all in person. So many of you are at foundations. You could probably tell me more about, what we're all seeing in our individual foundations. I have to say, I'm really just so glad. I mean, both proud and also kind of relieved at how the Asian American community is really stepping up and standing out around supporting our Black and Latinx allies on this, because it is kind of a new stage for our communities. I'm going to say, the foundation community, I think, really is working hard to try to step up and to stand out as well, and without trying to sort of detract from any of those really good intentions. I also will say that, the foundation community is all over the place. It's, it's not monolithic in the same way that our API community is not monolithic, and foundations are all at really different stages of development around where they are in this conversation and where they need to be. Of course, some of them are really experienced in this discussion and are really, ready to move and take advantage of the opportunities. Other foundations it still feels like it's kind of a new conversation, and there's a lot of experience and education that's necessary to help them kind of move forward and really make the kinds of changes they need to make.
And, you know, it's interesting when we were doing some of the prep calls, so many challenges in trying to do this work in our sector also emerged, and would love, Unmi, if you can continue to share kind of what are some of the challenges that you've seen in really approaching this work in philanthropy?
Well, I think I think of them as two major challenges. One is on the education level. So as I had said, some people are really experienced and others really need to understand better what anti-racism is going to look like, both within their own organizations and amongst their grantees. And so while there are a lot of foundations that feel like, yeah, you know, we've been funding in Black communities for, you know, years and years, they haven't really done the kind of racial equity analysis that's necessary to understand really where is their funding going, what are the kinds of organizations that they're funding, and what are the disparate impacts that their grants are making. And so that kind of equity analysis, I think, is something that, you know, almost all of us can really learn from. And I think it's a real learning process. You know, it's something that some of us have tried to do on a systematic basis for some parts of our work, but certainly even, you know, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And so we're all exploring that. You know, other foundations, you know, are still grappling with kind of issues around white fragility on their boards, you know, because they are primarily white. There are a few people of color really represented on the boards. And so sometimes there's there are a lot of difficult discussions that need to happen both on staff as well as at the board level. And then I'll say one of my big concerns is that a lot of foundations are stepping up and making statements loudly in support of greater racial equity. And my concern is about how long that's going to last, and whether we as foundations are really going to institutionalize some of the actions that we're trying to take today and really make sure that these activities, the analysis, the you know, the allyship is going to be there 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And so I think that's an ongoing challenge for our sector. I think one of the things that's great, but also a challenge for you youngsters on the call, you know, is that there's a real generational divide, you know, sort of the people who feel like I was there and I marched, you know, on the mall in the 60s, you know, they have a different view of what racial equity looks like. And, you know, today, communities of color have a much more ambitious view, which I think is really great. But that means that we have to well, you all have to bring along, you know, my generation that kind of feels like, you know, we really did a great job. And I don't know why you're yelling at us, you know, for, you know, how can you criticize me for being racist? I'm the last person who could possibly be. And yet there's a lot that, you know, I need to learn and that I need to change in what I do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Unmi shared that generational piece. I think Inhe, you really kind of spoke to that in that first question as well. And kind of, I guess, how do you see, what is the challenge that you see in that? Also thinking about the nonprofit sector and potentially addressing some of those generational divides. It sounds like there's been some momentum, but kind of other challenges that emerge with that.
Right. And as a community-based organization, I think there are different generations too. The one that Unmi talks about, and we also have the immigrant generation. So the very first generation of immigrants and their children and the next generations. So so I think I could talk about the immigrants. And, you know, as I shared that the younger people are really eager to move the first generation into this conversation in a meaningful way. And so, you know, and the challenge is that the first generation, this issue of race and racism conversation, they don't feel much of a part of it, you know, because they are, you know, I mean, so like they know that, for example, like they know that racial justice, they aspire to that. They share the vision. So then we have honest conversations, and we had them right away when all these uprisings were happening in late May and June and moving forward. And what happens is that, you know, we all get into a really good conversation at the beginning about why it's all wrong and why we need racial justice. But then we get stuck at the first generation saying, oh, but why do they have to be so violent? Then like the conversation stops, because the younger you know, or not just younger generation, people who really kind of have thought about it would be asking, that's not the point, but that's all they see. And you could say, again, bringing the media, is that where they're seeing all this? And so, you know, and what's important is that, you know, our first generation immigrants, I mean, we all know as APIs, the way that we talk about Black people historically has been not good, right? And I think that, you know, what's important to also remember is that our first generation come with such heavy history of war, genocide, you know, political repression. And like in all, you know, societies, like it's fraught with classism and caste systems, and some of our cultures as slaves, right? So they understand oppression. They just can't understand it in the US context. It's so much, you know, portrayed as a black and white issue, you know, maybe because of the history of slavery, right? So that's where the big issue is, and that's where the Black lives are getting killed. And so what we learned, and we actually have been doing this since about 5-6 years ago after we came back from Ferguson, is that you could just talk about all this stuff happening. They just think of it as just like words and intellectual exercise. But to really feel it and internalize it, we actually talked about all these issues in the context that they could understand, the oppression context that they could understand. So in the example of Koreans, we actually put this whole thing in the context of Korea being Korea when we were colonized by Japan. Then they really get it, right? So I think that those have been, so I think the barrier is not people, you know, we may be speaking in the language, but we're not really understanding, and we're definitely not taking it in. So I think that's a huge barrier. I think there are other barriers in our own culture that I don't think it's unique, but it's definitely, we know we have, is colorism. We have colorism in our culture. So like the lighter skin, you're revered better, right? And I think the colonizations by like European countries and Japan and, you know, US perpetrate this racial colorism and racial hierarchy. And it's all driven by capitalism, right? So we all come with that, and we hear it from our parents and grandparents. And so I don't know if you know, but I just recently learned that between China and Korea, the whitening cosmetic is a $44 billion industry. So it really kind of shows like our desire to be white, our desire to be light. And I think that really does impact in how we look at Black people, brown people, darker people. And already it just comes with that bias that I think we have to really be addressing and name and you know, talk about that, address that. I think we also have the issues around the reality of most APIs really don't have much interaction on a day-to-day basis with Black community. We don't live together, we don't go to school together. I think increasingly, especially in metropolises, it's getting better. But we as APIs in large part, I think we live in the suburbs, you know, we're kind of separated. So when these, especially like resurgence and, you know, uprisings happen, I think the desire is there, because I think APIs and students in the suburbs, as we see in our work, they are subject to racism, but they don't, you know, there's not much of a solidarity as what they would call now BYPOC, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so, you know, that separation is, you know, I think does kind of, it becomes much more where, you know, it's an understanding, it's something. So I think that's where they were so desiring to come on to stuff like, you know, our webinar with the leaders of the movement for Black Lives. And so, you know, I think that's another thing that I could say. I think I could stop here.
Would help if I unmute. It's so interesting to think about kind of the way that the role that history plays, but then also just kind of what you just shared really talks about kind of how white supremacy really is like, you know, infusing so many various elements that our community really has to grapple with. Grace would be curious just to kind of see, as you think about the challenges affecting government in this moment, what are you seeing?
Well, I think that, I mean, if you think about government in many ways in the political system, it's a very adversarial space, right? So you have Democrats, Republicans, liberals, Green Party, progressives, conservatives. And then in Illinois, we have the Black Caucus, we have the Latino Caucus, we have the Asian American Caucus, which kind of has like different agendas. I would argue that they have overlapping agendas, but there's not necessarily a people of color agenda or a racial justice agenda. I think that for those of you who are paying attention to what's happening on the state level, the Black Caucus has been taking a very strong leadership role in trying to define an agenda for the Black and African American communities in Illinois. And I think it's an absolute step in the right direction, and it's bold and important. And at the same time, you know, we are a very diverse state. You have the Chicago area, you have suburbs, you have collar counties, you have the middle of the state, and you have downstate, and then you have East St. Louis, and then you have Cairo down south. And so there, you know, there's no one way to approach this type of work in government. And so it becomes very, very complicated. And, you know, Illinois in a lot of sense, if you look at our makeup, is very much like the makeup of the country. You know, we have very progressive parts, we have very blue parts, and then we have very, very red parts. You know, we have in our system, as we're fighting COVID across all of our facilities and hospitals, we have people who are anti-maskers who, you know, do not believe, you know, that what we're sharing with them in order to protect the people that they're serving, that they need to wear masks, right? And so it becomes very, very challenging on a variety of ways, not just in terms of kind of how to execute government, how to keep people safe, but then if you're taking it to another level, when we begin to talk about, you know, structural racism and historical oppression and anti-blackness, you can imagine how even more complicated it gets. But I think the great opportunity, even as we talk about the challenges, is that we are unabashedly bold in wanting to have those conversations, and we're putting it front and center in the conversations that we have. And so, you know, Karenina and I were actually on a call yesterday because we have our racial justice mission statement, which it has us aspiring for the Department of Human Services to be an anti-racist organization, right? And so, you know, there was some kind of thought from one of our key stakeholders that said, well, that actually makes one assume then that you are currently a racist organization, right? And so, you know, I did not comment. Karenina did a great job in responding, but in some ways we are. In many ways we are. And I think putting that out there does a couple things. I think one, it engages people in a conversation. And number two, I think it puts it out there that we are not going to back away and give ourselves an out in really trying to tackle these tough situations. I think the other huge challenge in government, you know, on a statewide level is just the vastness. So not only the diversity, but just how large we are. You know, we have, our system is made up of humans, right? We're the Department of Human Services. We have almost 14,000 staff who believe 14,000 different things, who've had 14,000 different types of upbringings, you know, different experiences, background, teachings, learnings, and trying to kind of promote a unity of thought is impossible. But I think that there are some things that we are trying to build that will be universally at least understood, and trying to ensure that there are training and resources available. And I think attached with that vastness is that government is like, we're a ship. We're a big, huge ship, maybe even an iceberg. Like, it's very difficult to move us. And rightly so, because it's a protection, right? It's a protection that, you know, government can't be so easily changed from one administration to the next, that we have to have some things that are very solid. But that solidness can also serve as a barrier to changing more quickly and more urgently. And again, on the flip side of that, I would say during COVID-19, we've actually been able to demonstrate that we can move the ship quickly and protect the people who need it most. And going back to the challenge, that's also very scary if you have that flexibility and agility in the wrong hands, right? So I think it's a very good, delicate balance around really wanting to be able to drive change quickly in government, but also understanding that that quickness of change could also jeopardize people's safety if it's in the wrong hands and the wrong leaders.
And just, continuing with Grace for a moment here, one of the challenges that also potentially arises in this is kind of navigating some of the stereotypes that might exist about the API community. And just, curious about your various perspectives on how API stereotypes have either created opportunities or limitations for our community doing this kind of work and really addressing anti-Blackness.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm answering your question. I don't know if, I think it's stereotypes, but it's also kind of the labels, right? And so if I'm an Asian American, how can I ably and thoughtfully implement a racial justice plan in Illinois when the majority of the people who we serve are African American or Black? And how can I, lead an agency who's trying to develop an immigrant and refugee agenda that is welcoming and that is responsive to the disparities, and because I'm not Latinx, right? And so there, unfortunately, and I don't think this is just true in government, I think it's true probably in life, is there's just a lot of box checking. She doesn't check that box, how would she know, et cetera. And I think, as I shared with you, there's a Black caucus, there's a Latino caucus, and there's an Asian American caucus that is like growing, which is great. But I think we all know that in politics, power, people, and money, right, is where power emanates from. And so I think in some ways, I think that being an Asian American, I hope, and I want to be this, is somewhat of a bridge between the Black African American community and the Latinx immigrant refugee community, in that I'm not necessarily seen as being in one camp or another. And I try very, very hard to be super responsive to, my role, how I'm perceived, what people may project onto what I do or don't believe in. And so it actually takes a lot of time. Like I think that my antidote to that is spending a lot of time with people. And it's sometimes really hard to build relationships in this very dynamic kind of atmosphere when there's so many things that we have to do. But I try not to skimp on the relationship building with key leaders in different parts of our government system, because I want them to know like what I'm made of, truly. And so to break whatever stereotypes that they've accrued naturally along their life trajectory, and have them see that I came to this work because I care about racial justice, because I care about equity, I care about the human services system. And, sometimes those are just words until you can actually get to know someone and build relationships with them. So it's, I struggled with this, and Jay and Karenina would know too, when at Woods Fund, as an Asian American, running a racial justice foundation. Is that right? Is that wrong? Do we need, I think that there is no one right or wrong answer. I think that the best way to break stereotypes is to show them and to through action and through discussion and relationship building, because stereotypes are very strong, and so it takes a lot of strong intentional work to break those down.
So there's so much that you share that resonates, I think, just kind of in thinking about just kind of our own identity in this. And I think I'm going to actually transition into the last question so that we have some time for Q&A at the end. But so much of what you're saying, it really is connected to relationships. And I think as we think about what building solidarity is, relationships really matter in that. And so Inhe, would love to start with you and sharing a little bit about what does solidarity look like in this moment? How do we collaborate across sectors within the API community? And you're muted.
Okay. I really appreciated Grace sharing, the relationship building and seeing each other as humans, that's so critical. And it's like really wonderful to hear from you, right, in your position, in that vastness of that you manage. And it's interesting because at the same time, like I could say from a community also that we do need to bring up even, like policy information, so like there's a lot of data there's information about what's happening in the Asian American community that people don't really think about because of the stereotypes, right? Like model minority myth being a real big one where, we have to really, that it's really a white supremacy that named it and defined it. And it's a way to hide a lot of the other real issues that are happening and that has policy consequences, which in Illinois, we are already seeing such difference with Grace there in that position, around like language access and so many other ways that, we really see that as a community-based organization. So it's a huge testament to what Grace is doing. And, and I'm sure there's a lot of accurate information going out. So I think that in terms of information being shared at the government level and at the policy level. And I do think that when I think about solidarity, I do kind of think about it in two different ways. One, I don't know if it's different, but one is really at the policy level. We as community-based organizations, we do need some of that kind of structural change as well. And I think that as we think about solidarity, I think one thing that in this moment, as a community-based organization, immigrant organization working with undocumented people, I think it's really important to really realize that this country is so criminalized and how we are also so subject to that. I think in the community that we work with, often we kind of separate that out as Korean or Asian Americans. But like even from traffic violations to ICE raids and detention and deportation, of course, right? But even things like gang database, if undocumented person is on that arbitrary list, it's a direct link to the deportation process. And do people know that? Do people know that Chicago is not a welcoming city, with the ordinance still having to carve out around, those with the record, including gang database? So I think that when we think about our work, we have to really kind of, keep our eyes open and hearts open and really see what's going on and how we are so subject to the very things that are, it's the same force that are killing George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, that's also really discriminating and have been historically and now. But it's really this whole stereotyping or whatever, it's our anti-blackness. We're striving toward whiteness and we're sort of rejecting who we are as people, as people of color. So like as we work on Abolish ICE that we all participate in, many of you have, we should think about how that's so related to abolishing police and making that connection. Because I think there's a lot more commonality than we think. And so, and of course, like we see our young people they're always the leaders, right? They're always the ones who break barriers and they just go with it. So, they're involved in police-free schools. So that's really, I see such wonderful community building among young people. They're all across, all race, all that, and so much, Black, Latinx, and Asians really, that's like such a decriminalizing campaign that's led by young people, and they see police every day, so they're talking about, right? And so I feel like and also like, what's really wonderful about our young people is that because they are children of immigrants, they also see the value in connecting with our home countries, right? So like tonight, for example, HANA Center's Young People Fish, they're holding a panel or a teach-in with the activists from Chicago, but to Philippines and Mexico, to talk about what it's like to fight against police and the impact of state-sponsored violence, right? Because I think we understand why violence is, I mean, like, as I was saying earlier, when we talk about, Koreans fighting against the Japanese colonization or military dictatorship regime, there was so much violence involved. Tanks came, people were armed, and that was all right. That was all great. We get all so excited about that, right? So then why are we criticizing the young people in this, latest uprising? So I think those things are going to be really important to name it and understand it, and approach the how we are as allies is going to be really critical. And I think that last thing I just want to say is that I think that, we have to be, especially as nonprofits, there are funders here, there's so much conversation about this, that we have to be careful so that our work doesn't become performative, but then it really is about looking deeply at our community and, creating space where we can have honest conversations and really develop those relationships, not only among generations in our community, but also with other organizations that work with Black community. I mean, I just want to leave with you that HANA Center our young people had exchanged with STOP, the Southside Together Organizing for Power, young people coming together. And it was really amazing how the youth were looking at each other going, our youth have never been to the South Side before then. And so they saw other Black youth with ankle bracelets, and so it's like, what is that? And they were learning all about how that whole works. And then the Black youth didn't know about ICE detentions and deportations. And so they were learning about, wow, you guys get criminalized too. I mean, it was like this high schoolers talking, but it was really an amazing way for them to build relationship and learning about each other. And I think, yes, I think at the end of the day, it's a relationship that really builds. And then once we understand better, then policy could get easier. All of our work could get easier because we could fight together.
Oh, I feel like we had more time for this conversation, but I do want to leave some time for questions because I know that both Unmi and Grace also had some other ideas about solidarity, but I think some of it might actually just come up in the Q&A as we go a little bit deeper. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Jay, who's going to help to moderate the Q&A. But thank you all for this wonderful conversation.
Hi, everyone. I just messaged us in the group chat, but please feel free to use the raise hand function by selecting the participants icon. And at the bottom of that window, there should be a little hand function you can click on. Or if you're more comfortable submitting it in the chat, feel free to do that as well. But I think we have a time for just 1 or 2 questions.
Maybe while you're waiting for questions to come in, I just would like to say a couple things. I think that if you think about stereotypes, Asian Americans are not automatically considered as, allies for the Latinx or the Black communities. And so I think it's really, really important for us to make really public statements about our support. I was just so glad to see the big banners and the parades about, Asian Americans stand for Black Lives Matter, and all of the public statements that were made by the Asian American groups for that. I think that's really an important first step to, one, tell not only our own community, but also to tell the Black and the Latinx community that we are there in solidarity. I think it's really important for the Asian American community to understand and really appreciate that all of the benefits, all of the privileges that we have in American society today have been achieved on the shoulders of the African American civil rights movement. And it's only because they scooped us in their movement and said, it's not just about us. You have to include Asian Americans in this discussion as well. You know, so I'm part of the older group now, and but I will say, you know, 30 years ago, it was still a real challenge for Asian Americans to say, you know what, we are people of color. We, you know, we live in poverty. We are discriminated against. You know, we face all of this bias in American society, and we need to benefit from these anti-discrimination policies. And it was only because the African-American civil rights leaders said, yes, that is right, and they need to be included in all of these policies. And so we too today, from those benefits that we've accrued, we have to make sure that we scoop up the Black Lives Matter movement and the, you know, the Latinx communities, and make sure that they are benefiting from some of the things that we today have. So.
Thank you, Unmi. I think we have one question from Halesh.
Yeah, I'm so appreciative of the dialogue that's been happening, and I'm hanging on to what Inhe said about our work shouldn't be performative. I'm curious how you find the balance between supporting leaders of color and also changing philanthropy, changing the sector, because a lot of what I'm hearing, for example, from Asian American leaders and other leaders of color is that they will go through trainings, they will engage the work, but when they go back to their organizations, they feel stranded. They feel kind of isolated and alone. So I know that it's our job to both change the sector, but also support leaders. And how are you finding the balance between doing both?
I don't know. Maybe Unmi, you could go as a philanthropy person.
Yeah, I guess. Okay, Halesh, I'm not sure I get the question, or I guess I'm not sure I see the contradiction or the dichotomy in the question. Can you help me a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, and I guess this is not restricted to philanthropy, but there's a lot of organizations that send their employees off to do anti-racist trainings or to get better trained in engaging in these critical dialogues. But when the employees come back to the organizations or they come back to their respective sectors, they feel like they don't have the ability to make or affect change, and they feel stranded because the work's not happening back there.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Now I know exactly what you're talking about.
I was being a little coy. I apologize.
Yeah, you were being way too diplomatic. I think that is an ongoing challenge, and that's the institutional challenge, right? So for any institution, whether it's foundations or companies, to say, yes, we stand with Black Lives Matter, we put out a big New York Times ad on that, but then internally for people to say, you know, you guys are saying that externally, but that's not happening internally. And so what kinds of things need to change? I think that, you know, that really is, I think that's an opportunity right now where there's an opportunity to kind of step up and take advantage of that conversation and really challenge the management and engage them in the conversation. You know, we had talked about kind of what kind of role can Asian Americans play, and if the stereotype is true that Asian Americans are included in white conversations where other people of color are not included, then I'm going to say we need to take advantage of that and speak on behalf of our colleagues who are not in the room. And we have to take that responsibility on our shoulders and say that, you know, we have to take the risk of bringing up that conversation. And it can, you know, I'm going to tell you, it can be hard to do. I'm talking in generational terms these days. But part of that is because in my entire career, my whole life, you know, it's all been about assimilation and about trying to fit in and making change from the inside. Because if I pushed too hard, I was just going to get fired. And there was not going to be anybody else to have that voice on the inside. Today, there's a real new opportunity where there are many more voices on the outside that kind of create an opening to have the discussions on the inside. And I'm going to say all of us, all of our colleagues, we need to figure out how to take advantage of that. I will say I've been having a lot of conversations these days about white fragility, and where people are asking me, like, Unmi, what are people talking about when they talk about white fragility? Or, what do they talk about when they talk about white privilege? Like, I'm a white person, but I don't have any privilege. Like, what do they mean? And, they're probably asking their Black and Latinx friends as well, but they are, but people are asking me too. And it could be that, they might feel that I'm kind of an in-between, person who might understand that better, but, may not be quite so offended by that question. And I think it is our role to try to explain that, not only within our own communities, but also with our white colleagues, and to play that kind of role. I will say it's hard. But I'm going to encourage everybody to kind of take a deep breath, and sort of say, okay, I'm going to have this conversation.
I know I'm being mindful of time, but I just want to say that, we're a nonprofit. We're not at the, foundations with the type of board that you may have. But I do think that, HANA Center is made up of all, immigrants and people of color. But I do think that as an organization that also made statements, and we've been working on it, that in order to be really serious and really be accountable to what is it that we say and present and do all this stuff, is to really have organizational policy or framework around what racial justice means and how does that impact all of the different programming areas, in the mission statement. So we're actually revamping that internally. And as a way to then keep going from there to build out our work plan and our analysis and our approach. So I'm just wondering at the foundation levels too. I think that many foundations are obviously supporting this and funding this. But what does it look like internally in your own policies that really has racial justice framework? And as Grace said, it's the lens. So it's like putting the whole lens on. And I think that's what we all have to do. And we as Asian Americans in all our sectors have to lead that charge and really make sure that we're including, Black and Indigenous people and people of color in all our aspects.
Well, thank you all. I guess in addition to asking the question, I'm going to take the opportunity to close this out and thank all three of you for speaking today and sharing your insights as leaders that we look to as we're kind of growing this work. And thank you, Sonia, for hosting and moderating and kind of guiding us through the process. As always, if you're not signed up, please sign up for AAPIP Chicago updates. I learned at the beginning of this call as we were prepping that when this started out many years ago, there were, if I am correct in asserting this, there were 4 people in the mailing list, and we were up to 120 people. So I know that part of that is not just around the fact that AAPIP Chicago is growing, but it's around the fact that right now, as this conversation demonstrated, we're engaging and tackling some very critical issues, and we're ready for the dialogue. So thank you all for joining, and thank you very much for our 3 panelists and their leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I can remove people, I think. Yes.